Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have an episode to announce my new book. My new book is finished and published. It's out now. It's available on Amazon. I mentioned this a couple times before. So my new book completes the trilogy, the Learn trilogy, as I call it. So I had how we learn to move, learning to optimize movement. Those were both focused on ecological dynamics theory of how an athlete becomes skillful, right? Promoting the ecological approach, the dynamical systems theory, all the different principles there. This third book turns to the coach, right? How can we coach an athlete to become skillful in a manner that's consistent with ecological dynamics? How can we learn to implement ecological dynamics principles as a coach? So the book is called Learning to Be an Ecological Coach, Developing Attuned and Adaptable Coaching Skills. So what I wanted to do today is just quickly go through, kind of show you the chapters and go through, hit on some of the things I'm going to talk about, right? So the chapters are, so we're going to start with the preface. I'm going to talk about how I'm going to transition from the first two books focusing on how skill acquisition in athletes to focusing on skill acquisition in coaches. Hint, they're going to very similar models, right? Self-organization, constraints. We're going to talk about similar things, but with respect to coaches. In the first chapter, I want to focus on Gibson's difference between knowledge of and now knowledge about, and the problem of path descendancy, talking about some of the dissatisfaction people have seen with coach education research, and coach education programs, because coach education programs traditionally and typically have focused on how to coach, how it's focused on what to coach, right? Teaching you the content of coaching rather than how to actually do it, right? And that's a really critical distinction between, that reflects knowledge of and about. Like, I give the example of riding a bike. We could talk about riding a bike a lot, but that doesn't mean we know how to do it. That's a very different things. Path dependency is this kind of not very effective process that's happened in coaching, where you coach the way your coach taught you, who coaches the way their coach taught them. So coaching methods keep going unchallenged over and over and over again through the history, even though everything around us is changing, right? So we want to be adaptable. We don't want to just stick in the place. We want to be adaptable to what's going on around us. Then I'm going to get into talking about theory and research. How should you be using that as a coach? I'm going to fully recognizing there's some major limitations with published research. That it involves tasks that are very unlike sporting tasks in a lot of cases, accessibility, all those issues. And I'm going to get into the theory. I'm going to talk about some more contemporary internal model-based theories. I'm going to talk about why I don't think it's a good idea to blend theories or try to do both. I'm going to kind of talk about it depends, popular coaching, and those kind of things, right? And then chapter 3, we'll get into the actual model, this new alternative model of the coach, how you learn to coach, right? Coaching behavior, how you coach, right? What methods you use, how many reps you use, how much feedback you use, all those good things as an emergent behavior from the constraints that a coach faces, which are task constraints, what the rules of your sport are, what kind of equipment you have, so on. Individual constraints, which is based on your knowledge and previous experience, your model of learning, your theory of learning, and environmental constraints, like how many players you have to work with, how many, the social and environmental culture, right? The parents, all the governing bodies, all these kind of things. So we're going to kind of address all those things. Number 4, we're going to talk about applying representative design. What are the key principles of representative design, and how should I best be putting it into practice, right? And one of the things I'm going to emphasize in this chapter is the key difference between specificity and representativeness. Specificity is when practice looks exactly like the game, which a lot of people think is what we're calling for an ecological approach. That's completely untrue. We deliberately want to move away from the game at times to try to develop skill, right? And we're going to talk about, for example, why would I get a pitcher to throw a heavy baseball than normal, right? That has very low specificity. Throwing a 6-ounce baseball in a sport where the regulation ball is 5 ounces has very low specificity. but it is representative in that it has the same similar information, similar control laws, action fidelity, all these key components I'm going to talk about. And it has value. And it follows a basic principle that's been around forever that the Russians introduced, overload, right? So we want to be able to move away from the game systematically and purposely to work on things. And I talk about how I do that, and I go through a few examples that I use. Then chapter 5, I'm going to get into the main method I'm trying, we're going to promote as a coach, the most effective I method, the constraints-led approach. What's the logic of the constraints-led approach? How should you be designing constraints? What are some of the examples of the different things we can do with constraints? Constraining to afford, constraining to augment information. So I'm going to give a whole bunch of different examples of how I use constraints, how they kind of fall into these different categories, and keep focusing on the key logic and principles of designing constraints. Okay. Then we're going to focus on the special case of designing constraints, making skill easier for a new learner, right? And I'm going to compare and contrast the dominant information processing theory approach, which you hear a lot of times, that cognitive load theory, the idea of that, right? First of all, no one is denying that we need to make a skill easier for a new learner, right? No theory is denying that. It's just how you do it. The traditional methods that arise from cognitive load theory are task decomposition, perception action decoupling, scaffolding. I'm going to go through all of those and kind of critique them and point out the problems I see with those. And then contrast that with the main way we do it in the ecological approach, task simplification. And I'm going to give lots of examples of ways to do task simplification, constraining your opponent, scaling equipment, all these different things. Chapter 7, I'm going to talk about kind of the specific challenge of individualizing practice, right? One of the key elements we see, that I call it an inconvenient truth of skill acquisition, is that you need to individualize practice. Each athlete you work on needs to work on their own individual weaknesses to get better. We can't just give a blanket constraint to everybody. That's better than nothing in some cases, especially working with young athlete. But if you want to start getting higher and higher levels, you need to individualize. So I'm going to give some examples of how I individualize, in particular, getting the level of variability right for an individual athlete. Then we'll talk about the challenge of when you have to do that and you have a whole bunch of a group you're working with that have different skill levels. And so I'll give you some ideas for that. Then I'm going to get 8 and 9 are going to be the really kind of the coach's eye, right? How do you learn to observe movement? What are we going to actually look for when we watch our athletes, right? And I'm going to contrast the idea of an internal model of the ideal model, this kind of lens it creates, and versus looking for invariants, right? I'm going to define invariants for you, talk about how the best way to learn to pick them up. Then we'll talk about related things, how we perceive the affordance of others, right? How can you tell whether your athlete can run through that gap or catch that ball, right? It turns out you're very good at doing that. You can learn to do that very effectively. Okay. Then 10, I'm going to get in talk about 10. I'm talking about methods that people typically assume you must throw away when you adopt the ecological approach because they don't seem to fit. Here I'm talking about injury or visualization, demonstration, and verbal instruction, right? All three of those methods are perfectly acceptable in the ecological approach. There's ways that you can use them that perfectly fit with the theory, right? And I'll talk about the idea of a rate limiter and a rate enhancer in skill acquisition and how they can use them. For example, and I'll give some guidelines on how to use these three things. Then chapter 11 is a kind of chapter that I've been harping on for a while on what to do next. I've called this a few times. This is the secret sauce of coaching to me, the real art of coaching. Anybody can watch a drill on YouTube or read a drill in a book and set it up. The real secret sauce of coaching, from having worked with a lot of great coaches, is what do you do next? What do you do based on what you see the athlete doing in response to your practice activity? Right? Do you change the constraint? Do you add more variability? Do you abandon it completely? So I want to talk about some different ways and talk a little bit about how, give a little bit of guidance. I recently reviewed a paper asking to put more texture on the constraints-led approach, more guidelines for coaches, right? So I'm going to try to do that, right? I'm not going to give you a manual for how to use the constraints-led approach, step by step. No such thing exists or will ever exist in a thing that is consistent with the theory of ecological dynamics, right? But I'm going to try to give you some basic guidelines. Chapter 12, this important Environmental factor, this form of a life or culture we create around the team. And I'm going to talk about how important that is, how we do that as a coach, whether we want to emphasize defensive play, offensive play, both. The principles of play, that's where I'm going to bring up that, and how we, as a coach, we can make affordances more or less inviting. We create this landscape of affordances where some are more inviting than others. Right? This is really, really important. How to deal with kind of parents and other kind of things like that. Chapter 13, I'm going to talk about the importance of kind of inspiring these kind of higher level, beyond just simple perception action, talking about motivation, autonomy, and confidence, right? How the ecological approach fits perfectly with these ideas and how we can instill them in our athletes. 14, I'm going to talk about kind of review some of the papers that I've looked at, people's experiences. And throughout this book too, I bring in quotes from people I've interviewed on my podcast and their experience trying to move to being an ecological coach. What are some of the challenges you faced? What are, the chaotic, right? And I'll give you a few of my own experiences as well. I mean, I think I've told you I'm coaching a lot more myself. I'm coaching my stepson's teams this year. So I've experienced a lot of this myself. So I'm going to bring that in as well. Chapter 15, I'm going to talk about one of the key challenges that coaches face in the ecological approach. I'm going to focus on it specifically. How do we know whether it's working? How do we show that it's working? I'm going to talk about different ways that we can track and assess performance. Right? It's not going to I'm not going to be giving you simple off-the-shelf solutions. Right? I'm going to kind of explore different ideas based on what people have studied and do some thinking out loud with last. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about tools for coach education, right? What do you have at what can you use to move your coaching in this direction, become an ecological coach? To things like coaching, doing workshops, doing mentorships and apprenticeships. And also I'm going to talk about the idea of constraining the coach, right? This is something that I like to do. Constraining the coach is where you add a constraint to practice, not with the purpose of making the athletes better, but with the purpose of making the coach better, right? So I'm going to give you some ideas for that and explore some of those. So that's kind of the basic outline of the book, right? So I can add that to my shameless promotion slide, right? Got the podcast, my 3 other books, and then this one not coming soon. It's available now, right? So the easiest place to go on Amazon, or you can go to perceptionaction.com/books, or my website, and you'll find links to all my books. Right. So in this book, like what I'm trying to do, I think, I have kind of a unique perspective on all of this, right? So I'm a researcher and a professor. I've done a lot of research on skill acquisition, right? I'm a consultant, right? So I'm a skill acquisition specialist. I've been in the past 2 years with the Boston Red Sox, still doing that with a lot of different teams and organizations across a lot of different sports, right? Trying to apply this, right? So not just doing research and putting out theories, when I stand in front of a baseball player that's having trouble with this specific problem, what do I do? Which I know is what you're doing as a coach, right? How do I take this paper that had 30 participants and did these conditions and use that information for what I'm faced with right now, right? So that's what I'm truly trying to do. And then lastly, as I said, I'm doing this. I'm experiencing this as a coach myself, and I'll tell you some interesting stories where I get kind of snide comments from parents after they watch me practice. And I'm going to talk about how I'm trying to engage with the community of practice, the people around the team. For example, I'll talk about a presentation that I like to give to players, to kind of get them ready for this different way of coaching, this different way of design practicing. Okay. So that's it. That's the new book, Learning to be an Ecological Coach, Developing Attuned and Adaptable Coaching Skills, available on Amazon now. I hope you enjoy it. As I said, it completes the trilogy. Complete sounds like I'm finished writing. I've said that multiple times before. I'm never going to be finished writing. To foreshadow, the next things I'm working on are going to be a bit more sports specific. So I'm going to dive in a bit more into specific sports. I don't know. Maybe there'll be another maybe it'll be a 4-part series. You never know in the future, but I do hope you enjoy. And I thank everyone for their support and patience for waiting for this to come out. So cheers for now and keep them coupled.